So, today we're going to dig into something that feels kind of obvious. But trust me, the history behind how teaching became a so-called woman's job is way more complex and, frankly, pretty dramatic. I mean, just think back to when you were in school, right? How many of your teachers were women? My guess is most of them. And that's no surprise. Today, more than 76% of all public school teachers in the US are women. So the big question is, how did we get here? How did teaching become so overwhelmingly female? Well, here's the wild part. It wasn't always like this, not even close. In fact, if you go back just to the mid-1800s, it was the complete opposite. Teaching? Oh yeah, that was considered a man's job.
So to really get how massive this shift was, we've got to look at what education was like before everything changed. So let's head back in time, way back to colonial America.
You know, back in the early days of America, if you walked into a formal classroom, the person at the front of the room, almost guaranteed to be a man. Now, women did teach, don't get me wrong, but it was usually in these informal settings called dame schools, which were basically run right out of their own homes.
And this really shows you the two-tiered system they had going on. You had male teachers in the more formal grammar schools, and they were getting boys ready for the real world. You know, apprenticeships, business, college, it was serious career track stuff. On the other hand, these dame schools run by women were all about the basics for the little kids. Reading, writing, maybe some simple math. So when we talk about professional teaching, the kind with a real salary and some social status, yeah, that was a man's world, through and through.
So what happened? What on earth could be so huge that it completely flips an entire profession on its head? Well, the answer is a brand new, totally radical idea that accidentally created a massive nationwide problem. Okay, so here's the game changer. In the 19th century, you have these reformers, like the famous Horace Mann. People call him the father of the public school, and they start pushing for something that was, at the time, completely revolutionary. The idea? Free public schools for all children, a common school. It's a beautiful democratic ideal, right? But it came with a ginormous logistical nightmare.
Think about it. If you're suddenly going to build a public school in every single town, you need an army of teachers to actually staff them. And just like that, the Common School movement creates this massive, coast-to-coast teacher shortage like nobody had ever seen before. And of course, a problem that big needs a solution, fast.
So how do you solve a problem like that? Well, facing this huge demand for teachers, school districts came up with a solution that was, let's just say, economically practical. And with a little bit of clever marketing, it was ideologically convenient too.
Okay, so this is where it all comes together. It was kind of a perfect storm, really. First, you have that massive demand from all the new schools. We covered that. Second, and this is a huge one, women were a source of cheap labor. Third, you had leaders start to rebrand the job. Teaching wasn't an academic profession anymore. No, it was just a natural extension of being a mother. And fourth, believe it or not, this push even got support from early feminists like Catherine Beecher, who saw it as one of the only respectable career options available to women at the time.
And look, let's be real about this. The number one reason? It was money, pure and simple. This quote just lays it all out there. School districts realized they could pay women 1/2 to 1/3 of what they were paying men, so you could hire 2, maybe even 3 female teachers for the price of 1 male teacher. When you're trying to build an entire national school system on the cheap, well, that's some pretty compelling math.
And guess what? The plan worked. It worked almost too well. Women flooded into the teaching profession. But a social shift this big, this fast, it doesn't happen without consequences. It led to a brand new stereotype, and pretty soon, a serious backlash. I mean, just look at this number, 90%. By the early 1900s, women were upwards of 90% of all teachers. This wasn't some slow, gradual change. This was a lightning-fast, total takeover. In just a couple of decades, teaching went from a man's job to a job where, honestly, seeing a male teacher was the exception, not the rule. And of course, with this new army of female teachers came a new stereotype, the spinster teacher. See, a lot of school districts actually preferred to hire unmarried women. The thinking was they'd be more dedicated to the job, less likely to up and leave to get married and have kids. And so the words teacher and spinster basically became interchangeable.
This timeline really lays out just how fast this all went down and how the fallout evolved. So you start in the mid-1800s, and it's this great new opportunity for women. But by the late 1800s, boom, it's a female profession, and you get that spinster stereotype. Then by the early 1900s, people start getting nervous, and the backlash begins. And get this, by the 1930s, during the Great Depression, Some places actually banned married women from teaching just to free up jobs for men. Wow.
And this wasn't some fringe idea either. This backlash went all the way to the top. We're talking about President Theodore Roosevelt himself. He actually argued that when educated white women chose teaching over motherhood, they were committing what he called race suicide. He said they were basically failing in their patriotic duty.
So that kind of thinking, it really took hold. A full-blown panic started to spread, a fear that an entire generation of young boys, being taught only by women, was being feminized. And that led to this big push to get men back into schools, especially as principals and administrators, to create these manly bastions in a system that had become almost entirely female.
And that brings us all the way back to today. Think about it. This whole shift, staffing our schools with women, it started as a cheap, practical solution. It was an economic decision that was then dressed up with this ideology about women being natural caregivers. But that legacy, the idea that teaching isn't a profession but a calling, and maybe one that doesn't need to be paid as well, that's something the education world is still fighting against. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How much of the debate we have today about teacher pay, about respect for the profession, how much of it started right here, with these decisions made over 150 years ago?